The cracks are finally visible. 5 of NATO's biggest powers have quietly blocked a plan to spread the cost of arming Ukraine across the alliance. The reason? Money, voters, energy bills. In Paris, Macron called the man arming Russia. In London, restrictions on Russian fuel were quietly eased. The unity, it turns out, was never quite so united. Behind NATO's repeated pledges of unity and support for Ukraine, divisions are growing over who should bear the long-term cost of the war. According to a report by The Telegraph, 5 major NATO members, Britain, France, Italy, Spain, and Canada, have blocked a proposal that would have required every alliance member to contribute at least 0.25% of GDP towards military aid for Ukraine. The proposal was championed by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and was expected to be discussed ahead of the alliance's annual summit in Ankara this July. A NATO source familiar with the details said,
"The opponents were the UK, France, Canada, Italy, and Spain. They're not very enthusiastic about the idea."
Rutte had already signalled resistance to the proposal during remarks on May 22nd, saying consensus inside the alliance remained difficult.
"I don't think this one will be accepted because there's a lot of opposition against this fixed 0.25.
The plan was designed to spread the financial burden of supporting Ukraine more evenly across the alliance. According to NATO officials cited by The Telegraph, at least 7 member states supported the proposal, and all of them already spend more than 0.25% of GDP on military support for Kyiv. Rutte warned that only a small number of countries are currently carrying most of the burden.
What I want to achieve is that the burden is more evenly spread, that there is more burden sharing here, because at the moment, it is only 6 or 7 allies who are doing the heavy lifting."
The disagreement now raises broader questions about NATO's long-term cohesion, especially as some European economies face mounting domestic pressure over defense spending, inflation, and energy costs. The backlash also comes at a sensitive moment for Britain. On May 19th, London quietly eased certain restrictions on Russian energy-linked products, issuing temporary licenses, allowing imports of diesel and jet fuel refined from Russian crude in third countries, while also permitting maritime transport connected to Russian LNG terminals. The move reportedly surprised Ukrainian and European officials and triggered criticism that Britain was softening its economic pressure campaign against Moscow. At the same time, France's opposition to the spending proposal has drawn scrutiny because Paris, alongside London, has positioned itself as a leading architect of Europe's long-term security guarantees for Ukraine under the so-called Coalition of the Willing. Meanwhile, tensions inside Europe are also rising over Belarus. According to AFP on May 24th, French President Emmanuel Macron held a rare phone call with Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko amid growing fears that Minsk could become more directly involved in Russia's military operations against Ukraine. A source close to Macron told AFP that the French president warned Belarus against being pulled deeper into the war.
Macron stressed the risks for Belarus of allowing itself to be drawn into Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. He also urged Alexander Lukashenko to take the necessary steps to improve relations between Belarus and Europe.
The warning came just days after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia could be preparing a new offensive against northern Ukraine with support from Belarus. Belarus and Russia are also continuing joint nuclear weapons drills, adding to fears of further regional escalation. The diplomatic tensions underscore a widening strategic dilemma for NATO. NATO is facing growing pressure over Ukrainian drones repeatedly entering alliance airspace, as Sweden's Prime Minister openly called for greater Western involvement in helping Kyiv direct its drone attacks. The comments come amid escalating tensions across the Baltics and rising fears that the war in Ukraine could drift dangerously closer to direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson said NATO countries should assist Ukraine in directing its drone operations in the right directions, while dismissing Russian accusations that neighbouring NATO states are enabling attacks against Russian territory.
Well, it's my firm belief that the Ukrainians are they certainly don't want their drones to end up on friendly territory for obvious reasons. Sometimes it's a matter of jamming, sometimes it's a matter of other disturbances, and obviously they do not want them to happen because it could create damage, it could create fear, of course. But I think you should also realize that there is Russian willingness to give the impression that other countries are kind of doing things that are not legitimate, and that's why we should really not be open for the Russian narrative on this, but instead, of course, help the Ukrainians as much as we can to help them direct their attacks in the right directions, of course.
Kristersson made the remarks during a joint press briefing with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte after several recent incidents involving Ukrainian drones crossing into NATO airspace. Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR, claimed earlier this week that Latvia had allowed Ukraine to use its territory for possible drone attacks against Russia. Baltic officials rejected the allegations, insisting that their countries have not authorized Ukrainian attacks from NATO territory. However, several governments also acknowledged growing concerns over repeated drone incursions. Similar warnings have also been issued by Estonia and Finland following multiple incidents involving drones either crashing inside NATO territory or triggering military responses. Responding to criticism over the drone incursions, Kristersson accused Moscow of attempting to create what he described as a false narrative. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte also defended Ukraine while placing responsibility on Russia for the broader conflict.
This ridiculous claim by the Russians that Latvia was somehow supporting this. Totally ridiculous.
Since mid-March, Ukrainian long-range drones have repeatedly crossed Baltic and Nordic airspace while travelling towards targets in northwestern Russia, particularly oil export facilities in the Leningrad region. In Estonia, a Ukrainian drone described as Stray crashed into a power plant chimney in late March. Earlier this week, NATO scrambled a Romanian F-16 fighter jet to shoot down another suspected Ukrainian drone over southern Estonia. Lithuania has also reported at least 4 separate incidents involving suspected Ukrainian drones entering its airspace. Finland and Romania have likewise recorded multiple drone-related security incidents in recent months. In Latvia, political fallout from the drone incursions became severe after 2 drones struck an oil storage facility on May 7th. The failure to intercept those drones led to the resignation of Latvia's defense minister and eventually contributed to the collapse of Prime Minister Evikas Salīnas' government. Another drone alert on Thursday prompted NATO to scramble additional fighter jets in the region. Russia has strongly rejected attempts to blame Moscow for the incidents, arguing instead that Ukraine is either unable to control its long-range drones or is being assisted by neighbouring NATO states.